even Paul gives examples of women teaching, like with Aquila and Priscilla. Priscilla wasn't necessarily teaching in the assembly, but she was teaching a man. So we've got to figure out, what exactly is Paul talking about here? Is he saying that a woman should not be allowed to teach a man, or should she not be allowed to be a teacher of men? And this is a distinction that I usually make, is that everybody teaches. Every parent should be teaching their children. We teach each other all the time. This is another instruction that Paul gave, is that when you come together, everybody should be coming with a teaching, with a psalm, with, everybody should be bringing something to the assembly, both men and women. But we also have elders in our assembly. Brad and I are the elders. We don't have any female elders because that's a role that was specifically set apart for men. I don't think it's necessarily a sin for a woman to be a teacher or a leader or any of those. Yes, this is thus saith Jay and nobody else, or any of those other roles except for a priest at the tabernacle, because God was very specific about that. But it is a symptom of a problem. If there is a church that has a female pastor, there's a cultural problem here. And exactly what the problem is, I don't know, because I'm not going to go to that church. Not because I think that she's in sin, or that the people in that church are sinning by having a female pastor, but there's something else going on that caused them to have a female pastor instead of a male pastor. So there's some kind of cultural, something pathological going on there. And I don't know what it is. And I point to Deborah being a judge of Israel. It was not a sin for Deborah to be the judge. It was not a sin for anybody to go to her with their cases, or to go to her for teaching. The problem was that the men in Israel had just abdicated. They weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. So God appointed a woman, and thank God that he did. But that wasn't normal, and it wasn't the way that God set it up.
Deuteronomy 22, it talks about a woman not to wear the clothes of a man.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually referring to the role of a man. Don't play the role.
Yeah, it's not about your style of dress.
And there are certain roles to have, just like in Deuteronomy 22, it's the role of the father to protect the virginity of his daughter. I mean, it's his responsibility, And so ultimately that responsibility goes to him, just as it did with Adam and Eve.
He actually bore the responsibility.
Yeah, more so. And but again, I think looking at this in context, we got onto it a little bit last week when we were reading chapter 1, this is in Ephesus, where the temple of Artemis is there, and the temple of Artemis was to the Artemis, a female god like Diana or like Ishtar, and it was a lot of fertility rites. That's what we're talking about, sexuality. So these women, and that he's having to talk about to Timothy about this, is these women that are coming in now to the new church, they're new believers, their background and their culture was a different role, where they worship women and fertility rites and all that. And these women are coming in with exploiting their wealth even, doing their hair, and it's just not appropriate.
Likely in the role of men.
Yeah,
in that sense. And
it's just not appropriate. He's having to teach these people, and he's encouraging Timothy, it's just like, we have to teach these people the ways of God, and they're coming in with their bad habits, and because they're not familiar with the ways of God. So we have to set some rules in place, And I think, and you mentioned the synagogue. The synagogue wasn't. God didn't tell them to build a synagogue. God didn't tell them to separate the women on one side and men on the other. That was traditions of men, So yeah, it was there. It was the culture. Jesus and the disciples went to the synagogue, but that's not how God told them to set it up. It was just their cultural, traditional practice. And that was the thing that Jesus was always upset about. It was y'all's traditions over the rules,
elevating
the burdens that you're putting on that God wouldn't do that, So they're dealing with, just like we read in Genesis 22, how do we get the culture out of these people? God's truth, and that's what he's referring to here. He knows that all that are desires of all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of truth. The truth is Torah. The truth is, Jesus is the truth, And again, it was for us to all have healthy families where husbands and wives have certain roles, parents have certain roles in their children. It's a healthy institution.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I like that. I think it's interesting because I think we're in the same situation now. Like culturally, there's a lot of women excelling in the corporate world, but a lot of this has taken place because of women's liberation. And so we have women who every day go out and like they're in leadership roles, they're like leading people and leading teams and all this other stuff. And they're familiar with it because they lead in their homes with their kids. But we also have a major imbalance where a lot of them are leading everything in their homes. And then they're going into churches, and we see this in the church, like the church at large, the Sunday church at large, is largely led by women in terms of like most of the everyday kind of stuff. There's almost always a man on top though, like, you know, gotta have that particular figurehead. But there's a lot of ways that things are out of order. And there's a lack of male leadership underneath those male pastors in many cases. And there's good reasons for that, I'm sure. Less problems, you know, by the male leadership if they have more women under their authority than if they have men who might be strong. We can see that. But like, I think it's really interesting that like so many women are in leadership roles outside the church and are encouraged in that way by our culture. And then now we see this happening in the church too. And it's like, there's definitely some out of balanceness. And if we're taking our cues from culture, then we're going to see more of that. Where I don't think it's a secret that in the culture we're trying to create, according to what we believe that the scriptures are saying, is that we want men to be strong leaders in their homes and in their communities and in their communities of faith. And I think that that's very scriptural, but we have to go back and we have to look at what that, for practical reasons, we have to go back and look at what that really means. Does that mean women have to be completely silent and never be heard from? I think Jay has, clarified that. It's like, that's not what he believes it means. And I'm sure that's not what anybody in this room believes it means. But there is this reality of like, what does that mean about the order? What does it mean about how women are supposed to behave toward their husbands and how their husbands are supposed to behave toward Christ and toward their wives? There's a lot of order in all of that our culture is completely divorced from, and we're trying to, like, in our own lives, restore that and just be like, even if it doesn't impact anybody else, we still know we need to do it. But like, how do we impact the world with that? And I don't know. It's like, we just do it.
Well, and I think what we're dealing with today is a lot like what they're doing right here in Ephesus, that they were worshiping women, that the priests would be transsexual men in these temples. And here we are today, we've totally, in this culture, demasculated men.
Yeah.
To the point where we're even confused about our genders. And that's exactly what was going on in these temples. That was exactly what was going on in Ishtar. They tried to confuse gender, and these people are coming out of it. We're at the peak mega of paganism of the time in this city right now, in this book, and he's having this kind of like, it's the renewing of the mind. It's like, y'all are come out of that. We're now in a new assembly of believers, and we have to rethink what you're doing. And if the women, I would say, if they were used to that leading, they're not even allowing the men to be that role, to have that role.
Right.
So he's just like, you got to be quiet if you want the men to talk, kind of thing, because they're not used to that. Because what they've come out of, and we read it in Genesis, or Deuteronomy 22, with the crushing of the testicles and the eunuchs. I mean, that was pagan stuff going on, demasculating men, and that's why God said, you can't have relationship with these kind of people. They can't come into the assembly of God if they've been demasculated, or like we're doing to kids today. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because this was about the Abraham covenant, and you were supposed to be fruitful and multiply, not making eunuchs. Yeah. It's the complete opposite of what the covenant is.
Yeah.
And that's what I think they're having to deal with. Is like, that pagan culture of Ephesus looks completely different than the new culture that they're been grafted into
when I think even for us, like there's a lot of lesson in that coming out of our own modern culture to be able to, like, here's the teaching, and what we're not getting, because we have to figure out how to apply it to our modern world, is what does that actually practically look like? Jay doesn't talk, I might fill in the gaps, and that's fine for a time, but there's times where I'm like, I want to hear what Jay has to say. So I usually have to be quiet, but I think to hear what he has to say. And thank God that I actually want to hear what he has to say. Like that's something we've cultivated, and I have the level of respect for him. But I think culturally what we're also seeing is that, like, there's things that women who may be coming in and really love the Lord, but just have never seen it in action. Like, what does it look like to allow a man to speak? Like, to be silent and allow a man to speak and feel okay that you're not being ignored or you're not being diminished by that. Because I think we see a lot of that in our culture where women, have had certain experiences, and it's like they feel like they're not being heard or whatever. And it's like sometimes that's a really difficult thing to overcome. But I think ultimately, like, we're supposed to be modeling, like, what does it look like to elevate men to their proper place, to sit back and be quiet at times when we really want to speak. And so it's like there's ways in which, like, practically, like, it's not about women shutting up and not being heard from. It's about them giving the space even to men in this culture that God is trying to create for them to actually become who they're meant to be. And that is one big, big thing. Because I was 40 years old when we got married and had been independent for so long, I was hard to break. Like, we joke about it. Like, yeah. I called him yesterday saying something, and he said, "I'm so glad that you started out this conversation with the really important things." And I was like, "Well, you've trained me well, babe." And it's just, it's things like that. It's like, we're not perfect, but there have been some really practical lessons about, like, do I want what God wants about the way that I relate to my husband, or the way that men are supposed to be in this culture, and what does that actually mean for me? And I think, like, this was the same in that culture. Paul was telling Timothy, like, this is the standard, and then they're going to have to just submit themselves to that standard.
Look how confused young men are today.
Yeah.
Suicidal, depressed. They've told that actually being a man is bad. All men are evil. I mean, to grow up hearing that in this culture today, I mean, you're just destroying future men.
Yeah.